So this next part of our introduction to theory debate will be an in-depth look at the standards that are popular on a theory debate. This list is not meant to be comprehensive, but you should feel very comfortable with what people are arguing for the most part in a theory debate after reading and or after watching and taking notes on this lecture. So the first standard I want to talk with you is ground, Jack. So when people say you skewed my ground, obviously there's not actual ground that's being skewed, right? Both debaters stand on the same ground in terms of the actual geographic location. So it's not like one person has more earth that they're standing on than the other person. Ground is a metaphor. And so ground is also usually conceptualized in terms of playing field. That we come in with a hypothetical amount of arguments we can make, and those arguments that we can make are informed by the resolution. So usually the topic determines what are relevant arguments and not relevant arguments. And so if you walk into the November-December 2015 topic about jury nullification, and you read an AF about how adolescents should have the right to decide whether they want to have euthanasia, the argument would be that that is an abuse of ground, amongst other things, because that's not the relevant ground for that particular topic. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Now, ground comes in two ways, shapes, and forms. So if we think about the amount of arguments you can make, and we think about does a certain strategy give your opponent an easier time making more arguments or a harder time making more arguments, or maybe it's not, maybe you guys can both make the same amount of arguments, but maybe a certain strategy makes it so that the arguments that they're making are better.
Okay.
So even if the amount of arguments you can make are the same, it's not necessarily the case that the quality of those arguments would be the same. So, two things you need to be concerned about when you're analyzing if your ground has been skewed: quality and quantity. So, ground skew can be quantitative, i.e., a certain strategy gives your opponent more ground than you, or it can be qualitative, i.e., even if you get the same amount of ground, their ground is just a lot better.
Okay.
So let's give examples. If your opponent reads a plan indicating that we should have jury nullification in instances of nonviolent drug offenses. So they're saying jury nullification only in nonviolent drug offenses, right?
Yeah.
That plan might give both of you the same amount of ground, in the sense that the AF has ground saying nonviolent drug offense bad and jury nullification fixes it, and neg says either jury nullification doesn't fix it or prosecuting for nonviolent drug offenses is okay. So it could be the case that you guys have the same quantity of ground, but it could be the case that some arguments are just more persuasive than others. So it could just be the case that the negatives ground is qualitatively awful because the literature flows af. It is intuitively true that we should do the plan.
Okay.
So how do you judge when one side has better ground than another in terms of quality?
Yeah.
We need some metrics to do so. I think that the most common metric that people make is an appeal to common sense or intuition. And that appeal is sometimes the smart appeal is couched in terms of topic literature. The topic literature seems to be the best place to prove to your judge that there's literally just better ground that your opponent has. Because if there's no arguments in the literature, it probably is not true.
So what would be the metric for determining if you had a better quantity just?
So quantity is a lot more straightforward. Quantity is I have 6 positions, they have 5, right? And so the metric to determine quantity is usually can you list out just list out how many positions you have. So
Okay.
if you think your opponent can read an infinite amount of arguments in the world of their rule or their interpretation, you would say, look, like this literally explodes their quantity of ground. They can read anything they'd like, such as blah 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 blah. And the blah blah
Okay.
blah would be specific examples of what they can now read. And ideally, the examples you have are uh, indicative of the ridiculousness of their world, right? Because like you should point out the most um, hyper specific, obtuse examples you can think of, being like, look, like I'd have to defend jury nullification for nonviolent drug crimes in Nigeria and also in Nicaragua and also in Canada. All any of those arguments are fair game, and so everything would just compound, and the AF could choose the most minute, specific AF, and then the neg's just always running to keep up.
Okay. So is that the major points of ground?
Yeah, 2 other things I want to tell you. First is that usually ground skews happen in round.
Yeah.
A lot of the standards we're going to talk about happen outside of the debate, or the abuse happens outside of the debate, or before the debate, prior to the debate. This is an example of abuse that occurs during the debate. The next thing I want to talk to you about is that we will discuss a lot about weighing standards against each other. Because if you remember from our analogy, if the standards on a theory debate are like the contentions on substantive debate, then we need to discuss how do we weigh offense, right? We weigh offense on a substantive debate using some form of risk analysis or magnitude times probability. Similarly, we need some metric to do so in theory debate. So it seems to me like the metrics that we come up with should be metrics we use when we're deciding if you cheated or not. One metric, I think, a very worthy metric, is objectivity. Another very worthy metric is verifiability. It seems like arguments about quality of ground, unless they're backed up by topical literature claims, so you're reading a card from the literature that indicates that I don't have like the ground is bad. So some author being like, "Oh, this position is true. It's there's no responses to it." Unless you have that, you're sort of just saying your own personal opinion, and you're basing it on your own common sense and intuition.
Okay. What would the objectivity?
Well,
How would you
it seems like
weigh
you can't.
between?
It can't. It seems like you have a personal incentive to say that your ground was skewed. Right? It doesn't seem
Yeah.
like these rules are objective because it seems like your common sense now is the metric by which we determine guilt, and common sense is obviously not an objective metric. It differs depending on who we talk to.
Okay.
Additionally, it seems like if we are going to vote you down for cheating, we should be able to verify that you actually did cheat. And so,
Okay.
if we can't verify that the quality of your ground is bad, then we don't know if you actually did cheat.
Yeah. So would the same hold true with if they're just saying that we should just drop the argument?
those arguments become less important, but I would say they still hold through.
Yeah.
Now, notice that none of these complaints apply to quantity of ground. Quantity of ground is objective and it is verifiable. However, quantity of ground runs into its own unique problem.
Yeah.
Is a position that leaves the AF 15 different arguments it can make versus the neg 14 different arguments it can make abusive?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, if I am advocating for an interpretation which results in the affirmative having 15 different arguments it could read and the negative having 14 different arguments it can read, does that sound abusive to you?
No, that doesn't sound that abusive to me.
Right, so we can agree that there has been a skew in the quantity of ground, but it doesn't seem to be enough of a skew such that you've been being abusive.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm. So then would you just have to... What would be the metric for determining like how much quantity determines whether you lost or whether you should lose?
That's a really good question. So what you're asking for is what's the bright line?
Yeah.
How much quantity of ground loss is sufficient for me to be considered cheating? And the answer is that there is no objective bright line. They're sort of constructed on the fly as you go.
Okay. So would it just be something that you think is reasonable in the round?
Yeah, usually. But that's something that's
Okay.
worth pointing out to you, because when you're responding to it, right, you can say, look, the quantity disparity is not that huge, because even if I could read some more arguments, you still have more than enough you can read. The trick is being able to articulate what constitutes more than enough.
Yeah.
So, I always think that the best strategy when you're responding to ground skew is point out specific arguments they could have read. If you can list out 5 to 6 to 7 positions they could have read, that would be best.
Okay.
Okay.
So is that just the main way to respond?
Yeah, list out the amount of positions you have, and then analyze. The next thing I would analyze is, do they talk about quantity or quality? And what's their proof? Question the warrant.
Okay, sounds good.
And if it's quality, it seems like you can construct counter offense in the form of counter standards, and a huge advantage to them could be objectivity or verifiability.
Okay.
The next standard I want to talk about is predictability.
Okay. Would this be one of the standards that is an out-of-round standard?
Well, yeah, there's two forms of predictability claims. One is that your AF was unpredictable, so prior to the debate, I couldn't do any research that was relevant, and my negative constructive doesn't have enough evidence to be able to contest your AF. That's just one example of predictability skew.
Are there any others that would be relevant in round?
Yeah, there's a ton that are relevant in round. If you lie to your opponent in cross-examination, you have harmed in-round predictability. My in-round strategic decisions were predicated on you telling me the truth, not lying to me. So by lying to me, I have now done something differently than what I would have done.
So how do you determine if something is predictable or not?
Well, that's a good question. In the lying example, it seems like you just don't lie.
Yeah.
So, obviously, you'll never be able to completely predict what happens in the debate round, but you can set some certain constraints on what is and is not allowed to be unpredictable. There's a difference between good strategy and being abusive. Let me give you an example. Let's say that your opponent reads a necessary but insufficient burden.
Okay.
A lot of people argue that that kills in-round predictability for the AF because now the AF either underinvests on the nib or it overinvests on the nib, and either way, the negative is going to punish the AF for its decision. If the AF overinvests on the nib, the negative will just kick it and not go for the argument. If it underinvests on the nib, the negative will go all in on it. So either the 1AR allocates too much time and underallocates time on another layer of the debate, or the 1AR allocates not enough time and the 2NR spends all of its time on this layer of the debate. So what is...
instead of... Mhm.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, instead of like reading a theory shell, could you just say, or like justify an RVI? And would that be the same? Because if you won on the... Actually, never mind.
Yeah, an RVI doesn't make sense if it's on substance.
Yeah.
I think that understanding is a good one though, because a lot of people will just justify. They'll say that their necessary but insufficient burden is artificially sufficient. That's important. Artificially sufficient means that if you beat the necessary but insufficient burden, you will win the round, even if technically you don't.
So how do they justify that?
They grant that to your opponent, or they grant that to you because they don't want to deal with the theory debate. And so that solves for a lot of the predictability and the abuse concerns.
Okay.
Because now you don't have to underallocate or overallocate on the nib. You know that the nib would win you the debate.
Yeah.
So the same complaint about under and over allocating is the complaint for an RVI. Like the reason why people want RVIs on theory. People argue that theory is the new nib.
Okay.
Cool. Now, I want you to notice the interconnection between a lot of standards here. Because it seems like in-round predictability is also important for clash.
Yeah.
So we could then say that in-round predictability is an internal link to another standard. So standards can link to other standards.
So how would you... Could each standard, could it be the same way?
I would phrase it like this. Interpretation: all arguments that terminate in a win or loss for both debaters must be both sufficient and must be sufficient. Violation: you admit in cross-examination your arguments are necessary but insufficient. Standard: in-round predictability. Nibs kill in-round predictability because I either underallocate or overallocate on the nib in this speech, and you either go for it or don't go for it. Either way, I am screwed because I either spent too much time on it and don't get enough time on the substantive issues of the debate that are not the nib, and or I spend not enough time on it and all you do is go for the nib. Either way, time allocation gets very severely allotted against the AF in this scenario. Also key, so uniquely independent in terms of fairness because it is the metric by which, because in-round predictability is necessary for me to be able to get full leverage to all my arguments. Additionally, key to clash, in-round predictability controls the internal link into clash because absent there being some sort of predictability or stability with your position in terms of what you will or will not defend, there's no incentive for me to engage you substantively and have good clash because you will just kick out of the arguments that are best.
Okay. And then could you do that for multiple standards?
You could, yeah. Although you have to make sure you're trying to strike a good balance between being very thorough and in depth on the theory debate and also trying to get to the substantive debate.
Okay. So even if you do some people just spend all their time on theory?
Yeah, but I don't advise it in the beginning unless the AF is really abusive.
Yeah. Okay.
Cool. Now let me give you an example of in-round predictability skew that seems fair. Okay?
Okay.
Let's say the negative read a framework and then turns to the AF.
Okay.
The 1AR could concede the framework debate and go all in on turns to the NC, right?
Yeah.
That is an example of a predictability skew. In-round predictability there was that's a great example of strategy.
Okay.
But the difference between that example and the example with the nib is that both debaters had reciprocal access.
Yeah.
That strategy was available to both AF and the neg. The way it was available to the neg was that the neg could have chose not to read a framework.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
So it's just whether they have reciprocal access?
Yeah. Well, that can be one metric you couch it in. There can be others too.
Yeah.
Because then a lot of people will be like, oh, well, you could have read a necessary but insufficient burden as well. They're like, if reciprocal access is what we care about, well, you have reciprocal access.
Mm-hmm. So
So
they're just. Mm-hmm.
it doesn't seem like reciprocal access is the end all be all. Just because I can do it too doesn't mean it's fair.
Yeah. There are multiple ways you can justify
Yeah,
fairness.
and there's probably multiple things that are relevant to fairness and whether the in-round predictability skew is a bad one.
Yeah. Are there any other major ways to justify that there was a abuse in predictability?
Um, there are, but I think that conversation will get too nuanced and specific. So for now, let's move on.
Okay.
The next standard I want to talk to you about is strategy skew. So, strategy skew is sort of a broad, encompassing standard. And the first obvious question you want to. Oh, sorry, let's go back up to predictability. I want to give you strategies for defeating it.
Okay.
The biggest, most obvious strategy to responding to predictability is to say you were predictable.
Okay.
Another question you can ask is how predictable do I have to
would
be?
you justify that? Mm-hmm.
Sorry, what? Hello?
Hmm? Yeah.
What did you say?
I was. I don't think I was gonna say anything.
Okay. So you can say you were predictable. You would want to set up some criteria for predictability, right? Like maybe if it's disclosed online and there's 50 articles written on it, and I've been reading it for at least a month, and there are 10 other debaters who have posted this case.
Okay. Is that also kind of like setting up a reasonability bright line?
Yeah, sort of. It's a little bit different from reasonability, right? Because it sort of seems to indicate that this was predictable. It's not a question of if it was reasonable, it's a question of is it predictable?
Yeah.
So that's strategy one for responding to predictability. Strategy two for responding to predictability is questioning how predictable do I need to be? really pushing them on a bright line or lack thereof. And arguing that they need a bright line because a bright line is the key to verifying that I was or was not predictable.
Okay, so for the second one, do you basically just say that they need to establish some sort of bright line?
Yeah, well, you could say that, like, absent some sort of very clear bright line for predictability, you can't ever verify when I was or was not cheating. And that's crucial because if we're going to claim that I was unpredictable, we should be able to have some objective metric by which we decide that I was unpredictable.
Okay.
I think the next thing you can question is the impact to predictability. So what? Who cares? Yeah, I wasn't predictable. That means you have to argue more, and you have to come up with arguments on the fly. Arguing that me being unpredictable is maybe okay.
Okay. Are there any other major responses to
Those are usually
predictability?
the major strategies.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the next. Any questions about predictability?
Nope.
Okay. So then I'd like to talk about strategy skew. So strategy skew is sort of a broad, all-encompassing standard that can have several different things matter in terms of the strategy. So first is let's talk about what constitutes strategy. Could you give me a definition of the word strategy?
Just strategy or strategy in the context of a debate round?
Strategy in the context of a debate round.
Okay. I would say strategy in the context of a debate round would be your way of winning, how you choose to win the debate round.
So it's all the things that go into you winning a debate round?
Or, yeah, all the ways that you try to win the debate round.
Okay. That's not bad.
What would you say? Okay.
I I would say it's all the ways you try to win the debate round, but I would point out specific things that are necessary for you to win a debate round. So your strategy could be skewed by having access to less prep time, to less cross examination time, um, and obviously not less in the sense that your timer is less, right? Like the judge isn't going to say the AF gets 2 minutes of prep time, the neg gets 4 minutes of prep time. You'd have less access to that prep time in terms of quality of the prep time. So maybe you printed out your
Okay.
case and you handed it to your opponent, but your opponent refuses to hand you their case in terms of either giving you it on a flash drive or on in a paper copy. So your prep time has been skewed.
Yeah. One judge in one round was telling me that, like, it was a rule that you couldn't hand your case to your opponent or they couldn't hand the case to me in cross examination.
I can't really comment as to the validity of that statement. It may have been a rule at that tournament, but I can certainly tell you that in national circuit debate rounds, that is not a rule.
Yeah. I was a little bit confused.
Yeah. So, prep time. That seems to be one way your strategy can be skewed. So does what we talked about with in-round predictability. That seems to be another way your strategy can be skewed. With the example I gave you with necessary but insufficient burdens.
Okay.
So we would refer to that as time trade-offs.
So, are there any other ways that the strategy is skewed besides time?
Well, yeah, it seems like if you have awful ground compared to your opponent, that would also be a form of strategy skew.
Yeah. Do some people just read one standard and then, uh, try to link it into a bunch of other standards?
Yeah, that's definitely an approach. Also,
Yeah.
notice how
Would
a,
you?
a lot of
Mm-hmm.
these arguments are just interconnected, right?
Yeah.
So you could say, uh, strongest reason to prefer my interpretation is because it makes sure that there's no skew in the quality of ground. This round is a perfect example. He has reduced my arguments to positions such as genocide good or rape good. Those are awful arguments, and that means that I'm always going to be behind on the line by line. He has a much easier chance of winning the debate because the quality of his argumentation is a lot better. Also skews my strategy because it means that I have no line by line responses I can make. I can't engage him substantively, which means I'm always forced to read generic uplayering strategies, probably uniquely bad because it kills Clash. Also means that I don't get to beat him on the layer that he introduces. Means that the AFK has a guaranteed layer that they can try to collapse the debate back down to. That is not the case for the negative. The negative has to introduce and accurately defend and win the layer that it introduces as a layer higher than the substantive debate. Kills Clash, obviously, because it indicates that the debate will not happen at the level originally introduced in the debate, because the original introduction by my opponent was done in a ridiculous manner where my ground is reduced to really unintuitive arguments.
Okay.
So that's just one example. So almost everything we talk about can be conceived of as a strategy skew.
Yeah.
So in general, I think that when people read strategy skew, what you want to do is you want to isolate the specific reason they say your strategy they say you skewed their strategy. Is there a reason based on timing, on ground, on predictability, on reciprocity, on research, etc.?
Okay.
Make
What
sense?
would be? Yeah. So is that the main way to respond to it? Just to isolate?
Isolate the internal link to strategy skew and then respond to that internal link. Either
Okay.
deny that you're not doing it, say that your opponent is doing it as well, uh, or say that doing it is not that big of a deal, or that you're doing something else, you're offering some other solution in return.
Okay. What would you say if you were to respond with you're offering another solution?
I
What
would
would
say,
be an
yeah, I'm
example?
skewing your strategy in this way, but I'm also giving you this, which skews my strategy in this way, which means that they both cancel out.
Okay.
Or, yeah, I'm skewing your strategy, but skewing your strategy is good because it's already easier for you to win the debate. So I need to be compensated for the fact that it is easier for you to win the debate, which means that strategy skews are good things.
Okay.
Cool. Next standard I want to talk about is time skew. So, usually time skews only happen in a real debate round, not before the round or while you're at home, before the tournament, etc.
Yeah.
Time skew only really makes sense in the context of the actual round itself. The next thing is, notice how the quantity of time is never skewed. You'll never have a debate round where you get to give an 8-minute 1AC or a
Yeah.
6-minute 2AR.
Okay. So how do you determine if uh, there is a time skew in the debate round?
Good question. I think the easiest way to determine if there's been a time skew is to analyze. It's to think about it in two ways. The first way to think about it is, let's say it's the rebuttal speeches. Analyze how much access to the constructive speeches are you getting? So, for example, a plan-inclusive counterplan that says, let's do all of the AF but one minute instance, right?
Yeah.
The 1AR doesn't seem to be able to access a lot of the AC. Because the AC was agreed to in 99.9% of instances by the negative.
Okay.
So the amount of arguments, the amount of time that the 1AR can leverage from its initial constructive is basically non-existent.
Yeah.
So do you see how that's a time skew?
Is it just a time skew because they basically like mooted most of your ground because they only change one
It's not
small
even
thing?
well. Yeah, that's another reason it's abusive. But the time skew is not because they mooted your ground. The time skew is because you don't get access to the AC anymore. So the time skew is
Okay.
that you only have 4 minutes to beat a position that they spent constructing for 7 minutes. And then they have 6 minutes to defend that, and you have 3 minutes to defeat their defense. So you get 7 minutes on the pick, but they get 13 minutes on it. And the
Okay.
reason you get 7 and not 13 is because you don't get access to your AF anymore.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one example of time skew where you are trying to determine if their strategy prevented you from accessing the original constructive.
Would there be any other positions that didn't on the negative that don't allow you access to your constructive?
A lot of people will argue in favor of the RVI because they'll say that theory means I don't get to access the AC anymore. You made the AC irrelevant by reading theory.
Yeah.
So the debate basically starts over again.
What do people respond to that?
Well, they say even if the debate starts over again, you have the ability to access arguments at that new starting point.
Yeah.
They also say that's the burden of rejoinder. I have the right to respond, and so yeah, I might come up with new responses, but that's a reason you need to respond to those new responses, not a reason I should be punished. In your world, I have to respond to the AF and only the AF every single debate, which doesn't really seem to be a good model for argumentation. I should be able to introduce other reasons to not vote affirmative that the affirmative then has to engage with.
Okay, that makes sense.
So that's one type of time skew. The next type of time skew is in terms of time skew of future speeches in the actual debate round itself. So you'll argue that the 1AR is unnecessarily hard because your 2AR time will be skewed. Now, we call this bifurcation. The 1AR got split in half. And only half of it will matter come the 2AR. So you still got to speak for 4 minutes. It's not like this is a quantity of time issue. It's a question of will you get access to those arguments? Will they be relevant to the winner of the debate round?
What would be an example of this?
Nibs are the perfect example. The argument that nibs are bad is very well articulated in terms of time skew because they say, look, when the one end reads a nib, the 1AR either over or under allocates on the nib, and the 2NR gets to choose whether the nib is relevant, which means that the 2AR has no sense of security in the investment that it places in the 1AR.
Okay.
So you invest let's say you invest 2 minutes on the nib in the 1AR.
Yeah.
And the 2NR decides, well, that means Paris undercovered substance, so I'm going to kick the nib and then go for substance. And remember, kicking the nib has no negative consequences for your opponent.
Yeah.
So now, in the 2AR, I'm responding to a 2NR that basically got rid of half my 1AR. I only have 2 minutes of my 1AR to use against the 2NR. And we have a rule in debate that I'm not allowed to come up with new arguments in the 2AR unless it's directly responsive to new arguments that the 2NR made.
What if they say that they can't kick the nib?
If they can't kick the nib, then that seems to solve a lot of the time skew.
Okay.
But it still creates it still doesn't solve the other time skew we talked about, right?
Yeah.
Because the nib makes the app irrelevant. So even if they agree that you winning the nib will result in you winning the round, it begs the question of why are they allowed to just get rid of the value of your app speech? Their response will be, well, that means you wrote a really bad AF. Your AF should have been written to deal with positions like this. It's not my fault that you're bad at case writing.
Okay.
And then the argument in return becomes, well, it's also another source of abuse there. Maybe you're right on that particular charge, or not by charge, I mean issue. But maybe another source of abuse can be that nibs, artificial sufficiency in the context of a nib, so saying the nib is artificially sufficient, and that means it's fair, that argument seems to run into a problem of strategy skew, because that means that the debater who reads the nib can basically decide the issue in which the debate round is won or lost off of.
Okay.
So we call that pigeon-holing. Does that make sense?
Explain it one more time.
Yeah. So the concept of pigeonholing is like this. Do you know what pigeonholing is in real life?
When you force somebody
Into a corner.
A situation?
Yeah, or like a corner.
Yeah.
So like in boxing, right? You usually want to try to pigeonhole your opponent into like one side of the ring.
Yeah.
So in debate, if you think about debate as a chess match, a huge part of that chess match is determining where the debate will be resolved. If I'm really good at the util debate, I want the debate to be resolved on util. If my opponent's really good at the framework debate, they probably want the debate to be resolved on framework. If somebody else is really good at the theory debate, they probably want the debate to be resolved at theory. So where the debate gets resolved is a huge strategic concern. It is super relevant to strategy.
Yeah.
So if a certain strategy arbitrarily lets your opponent decide where the debate gets resolved, doesn't that seem to be a huge source of potential abuse?
Yeah, it does.
So the nib may be fair because your opponent said, look, if you beat the nib, you win the round. And so that sort of seems to solve for the time skew concern and probably solves for the reciprocity concern or the in-round predictability concern. But it doesn't seem to solve for the pigeonholing concern.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So do you see how theory can be very it's a really interesting form of argumentation to me, and it's because it's almost infinitely open-ended.
Yeah, seems interesting that you could basically create any theory violation or rule and see that your opponent violates that and set any rule besides like the basic time.
Exactly. It's interesting that we create the rules as we go. You know how earlier we were talking about objectivity, how like if our own common sense or intuition is the metric by which we decide what is good and bad quality ground? It seems like we would be biased and we would be inclined to indicate that our opponent's arguments are always way too good and they don't give us good arguments in return.
Yeah.
Similarly, it seems like theory runs into a bias, which is that we always want to claim we got abused. And we always want to claim that our rule is a good rule, even if we don't actually personally believe that.
Mm-hmm. So, do a lot of people run like frivolous arguments in theory?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people do that. There's been some sort of, I guess, pushback against frivolous arguments. But not really a lot, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Okay.
Cool. So, this has been a very good conversation so far. We're going to try to talk about 2 to 3 more standards, and then that's going to be a very comprehensive introduction to fairness standards. And after that, we'll have the next lecture be on education-based standards.
Okay.
So, the next standard I want to talk to you about is research burden. Research burden talks about the pre-round preparation requirements from various strategies.
Okay. So how do you determine this standard?
Some research burden, the common debate on research burdens is based on how specific the AF is. The more specific the AF is, usually people say that explodes research burdens. Because that means the negative needs to be prepared for all specific affirmatives.
How do you set the bright line for whether an affirmative is too specific?
That's a good question. As you're starting to see, there probably is not an objective bright line with anything. Because we are the caretakers of the rules, and us as caretakers, we don't have an objective committee the way a baseball game committee does or a basketball committee does. Our bright lines will inevitably be case specific and contextual. So, obviously doing some research is good, but it seems like if a certain position would require you to fail all your classes and to stop being a good son or daughter or friend and to stop doing any like clubs and just work all day 24/7 cutting cards for every position, that seems probably like overkill.
Yeah.
I think we could persuasively argue that the research burden there is way too high.
And then could you also respond to this like you responded to another argument by saying that arguments on the fly can be a good thing?
Yeah, definitely. You can make those arguments. You can also make arguments that your counter rule has sufficient criteria in it to make sure that the research burden is reasonable. Like your counter rule is that you have to have this disclosed online, which means that your research gets streamlined. It's not like you're sitting there thinking, oh, they could read any possible position ever, and I have to prep all of it.
Are there any other major ways that people respond to research?
Yeah, they say that we could have another criteria of topic literature. That if there are more than 50 peer-reviewed journal articles on the topic, then we should be able to read this argument because you should have been able to come across it in your research. And the number 50 can change.
Why do people say 50?
There's no reason, right? 50 sounds better than 5 and sounds worse than 500. Usually it's dependent on how many articles there were on your app.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yep.
Cool. Did we talk about responding to time skew, by the way? I don't think we did, right? Let's do that real quick.
No, I don't. Okay.
So
we talked a little bit about pigeon-holing.
Yeah, but let's talk about beating time skew. The first thing you want to say is that your time was not skewed. You do have equal access, or you could have done something else that would have won you the debate. The second thing you probably want to do is make contextual case-by-case specific responses. Most time skew arguments, when they're ran, Jack, are not comparative. So they won't compare how much time is skewed in the world of the interpretation versus the counter-interpretation. They'll just say nibs skew time. They won't say a world without nibs would have been a lot less of time skew. So if you can establish that the alternative would have also skewed time, it would make time skews non-unique. However, that argument is dangerous, right? Because you have to establish the other source of time skew. And it also seems to potentially beg the question, why is this source of time skew okay, even if there are others?
Okay. Are there any other major ways to respond?
Yeah, I think the next major way to respond is to point out that every strategy in debate skews time, that time skews are the very fundamental nature of strategy. Good strategy is designed to maximize your time and minimize your opponent's time.
So then you just have to determine what strategies skew too much time?
I guess, I mean, when you're responding to it, you want to characterize it as all strategies skew time, so don't punish me for doing something that everyone does.
Yeah.
This is like the equivalent of like a baseball player being like, everyone takes steroids. Don't get mad at me for taking steroids.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yep.
Cool. So, let's move on to our next standard. Real quick, last thought on time skew. A really well-articulated time skew argument that is specific to your strategy is often the most persuasive theory argument that exists. It is the hardest argument to defeat.
Okay.
Because, in general, some arguments on theory are just true. And so, responding to the theory arguments that are probably just true at the level of the standard is the toughest theory debate to execute.
Okay.
Cool. The next thing I want to talk to you about is reciprocity. Reciprocity seems to be the very definition of fairness. Right?
Yeah.
The word reciprocity itself means both sides have equal access.
Okay.
Reciprocity is also sort of like strategy skew in the sense that it is a very broad standard. Reciprocity can be analyzed in terms of time skew, in terms of ground skew, in terms of predictability, in terms of research burdens. So you could have an irreciprocal skew of time, irreciprocal research burdens, irreciprocal pre-round predictability, etc.
Okay. So how do you prove that somebody
So
wasn't
you have to
reciprocal?
construct using formal principles of logic that you did not have access to that strategy, but they did. Usually, you point out this what happened. You just make an argument that's not reciprocal.
What would you say in the example of nibs?
So I would say uh, time skewed by nibs are irreciprocal because I don't get access to all of my speech from the 2AR, but you definitely get access to all of your speech from the 2AR. You get to choose, in fact, which part of the speech you want access to, and that choice is exacerbating the abuse because you get to choose. Your choice is going to be based on what I was worst at in the 1AR, which means you'll punish me for my good arguments by not having to respond to them, and you will be able to just only respond to my bad arguments. So it's inherently irreciprocal on numerous levels, both in terms of the ground of the arguments you have to respond to and where you're forced to clash to, and in terms of time.
So basically, they have two roads, or you have to. They have two roads to the ballot, and you have one.
Yeah, exactly. And that results in a lot of irreciprocal things.
Yeah.
Exactly. The next thing I want to point out to you is that reciprocity is the necessary but insufficient standard in debate. What I mean by that is that strategies that are reciprocal are not necessarily fair. But strategies that are not reciprocal are definitely not fair. So being reciprocal is a necessary standard or necessary criteria to being fair, but it is by no means sufficient.
Okay.
That's important to understand. Now, this type of nib doesn't seem to be unfair.
Yeah.
Right? Because this is a nib within a layer. This is just how the logic of this argument works. This doesn't mean that every time you read reciprocity, you're being unfair.
Yeah.
So notice how there are legitimate necessary but insufficient burdens and illegitimate ones.
Okay. So how would you respond to reciprocity?
The strongest argument is to show it is reciprocal. If indeed you are being irreciprocal, Jack, you need to provide some counter compensation. You need to provide something that you are offering your opponent in exchange for being irreciprocal. Or you need to argue that you being irreciprocal is balancing the debate round for some other criteria.
How would you argue that it's balancing the debate round?
I would say something like, affirming is harder than negating. So yes, this AF is irreciprocal, or this AF strategy was irreciprocal, but being irreciprocal is necessary because you already have an easier time winning the debate, which means I'm just evening the playing field.
So you could always say that being irreciprocal is good as the affirmative.
You could, but those arguments are very generic and have usually been dealt with very well.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can certainly always make them, but they're not the strongest. Also, it sort of seems to be counterintuitive, right? Like, being irreciprocal doesn't seem to be a right that you get just because you're on the harder side of the debate.
Yeah.
You also have to win that you are on the harder side of the debate, which is by no means a given.
Okay.
Cool. So we are at the end of our analysis on the fairness debate. There is one huge standard I do want to talk about, which is textuality, but we'll start with that next time because textuality applies sort of independently of fairness and education in a lot of debates, and it definitely links into both fairness and education. So it's a really good starting point for our discussion about education as well.
Okay. Sounds good.
Cool. Do you have any questions about any of these?
No, I don't.
Okay. Was this helpful?
Yep.
Cool. So if there's no questions, I look forward to next time when we'll start with our conversation about textuality and use that as sort of our bridging gap into education.
Okay. Sounds good.
Cool. Have a great night.
You too.